At 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, at Register 3 of a fresh produce market in Providence, a 76-year-old woman searched her coat pocket for the fourth time. On the belt in front of her, there were only 3 bananas. $4.20. If you can't pay, leave the items and step aside. Other people are waiting. The manager said it loud enough for the whole line to hear, and the whole line heard it. Someone sighed. Someone started remarking on the shoes she was wearing, on why a person would walk into a store like this with nothing in her pocket. The old woman did not argue. She only said quietly that she had brought her wallet, that she must have left it at home, and asked for 1 more minute. Nobody gave her a minute. Somewhere near the back, a phone came up and started recording. Then the manager called security. That was when the cashier at the register stopped what she was doing. Her name was Addie Marsh, 27 years old, 2 years on the job. In her apron pocket, she had $9.25, the exact remaining amount her younger sister needed to complete her $48 exam fee before 5 o'clock that afternoon. She looked at the old woman. She looked at the 3 bananas. Then she put every cent of it on the counter and scanned them through. The line behind her laughed. Someone said 3 words. Not her business. 40 minutes later, Addie Marsh lost her job and walked 4 miles home. She had no idea whose mother that woman was, and she had no idea that the video someone had just recorded would change her entire life in a way nobody standing in that store could have seen coming. If this story reaches you, leave a like so we know you're here. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And subscribe so you can walk through the rest of these stories with us. The manager's office sat behind the cold storage room, barely large enough for 1 desk and 2 chairs. But Desmond Pike didn't invite Addie to sit down. He left her standing there for nearly 2 minutes while he typed something on his computer, then finally looked up. He didn't mention the old woman. He didn't mention the 3 bananas either. He turned the screen toward her, pointed to a line of red text, and asked if she knew what it meant. Register 3 showed an unauthorized cash transaction and an unverified drawer discrepancy. Addie stared at the number, and it took her a moment to understand. She said the old woman had only been charged $4.20, that she had handed over $9.25, and the difference was her own personal money trapped inside the drawer when the stop command locked it. Pike said that by forcing her personal money into the register, she had chosen to violate procedure. She said she hadn't chosen anything, that he was the one who had ordered the transaction stopped, and once the stop command was entered into the system, the coin drawer locked automatically. Pike said exactly, and that was why he had to write it up. He turned the screen back toward himself and typed 3 words, slowly enough for her to hear every keystroke. Cash handling violation. Addie stood still. She understood that her money would never be recorded as change. It would be framed as an unauthorized interference with the system, and in an employee file, a cash handling violation meant only one thing. She said she was willing to have the store deduct it from her paycheck. She said she was willing to work night shifts for an entire month, willing to take a warning, willing to sign whatever paperwork he wanted. She said her mother had been gone for more than a year, that it was just the 2 sisters now, and this job was the only thing they were holding on to. Pike listened to all of it. He let her finish every word. Then he closed the laptop and said her mistake wasn't the $5.05. Her mistake was deciding for him in front of customers. Addie said she had only bought 3 bananas for an old woman. Pike said kindness wasn't in her job description. He said it calmly, as if he were reading a clause from a contract. And it was that calmness that made Addie understand this hadn't been something he had come up with in the last 40 minutes. She remembered. 3 days earlier, she had stood in this very room with her notebook in her hand and asked him why the produce scale code had been changed the month before without anyone being told. She had asked why the same supplier and the same item showed 2 different unit prices on 2 separate receiving invoices. That day, he had laughed and told her to mind her own business, and she had thought the matter was over. Now she understood it had never been over. He had only been waiting for an excuse, and at 10 o'clock that morning, in front of 20 people, she had handed him one. She took off her apron. She placed it on the desk, folded carefully the way she always folded it at the end of a shift, and then she walked out. Nadine Kowal was standing at Register 1, one hand still resting on the scanner, her eyes following Addie. Nadine didn't say anything. No one said anything. Addie walked through the glass doors, stepped into the parking lot, and stood there for a while. There wasn't a single dollar left in her pocket. The number 11 bus stopped across the street, and she watched it pull in, open its doors, close them again, and leave. She started walking. From Harvest Lane to the apartment above the laundromat was 4 miles. She walked the entire avenue, crossed the bridge, past the old factory district, and she didn't think about the old woman. And she didn't think about Pike. She thought about 5 o'clock that afternoon. She thought about the envelope for Junie's exam fee that Junie had already placed on the kitchen table the night before, and about how there was nothing in that envelope now. It took her more than an hour and a half to get home. When she turned into the alley, Junie was sitting on the steps outside the door with her books resting on her lap, and the girl sprang to her feet the moment she saw her sister. Addie had already prepared an entire sentence in her head. She was going to say she was sorry, that she would borrow money from someone, that Junie should just wait, that she would find a way. But Junie didn't ask about the money. Junie didn't ask about the exam. Junie looked down at her sister's shoes, then up at her face, and asked only one thing: whether she was tired, whether she had walked all the way home. Addie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She sat down on the step where her younger sister had just been sitting, and she stayed there for a very long time. Junie sat down beside her and didn't ask anything else. Above them, the laundromat sign crackled the way it did every afternoon, and Addie didn't know that 9 miles away, in a room lit by a single glowing screen, a man was replaying the store's security footage, rewinding the same 40-minute stretch again and again, and counting every second. Antonia Belandi reached the gate just before noon, carrying a paper bag with 3 bananas inside, and she walked up the slope toward the house as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The 2 men stationed at the gate stepped toward her the moment they saw her, both of them pale as paper. One asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. The other said they hadn't known where she was for 40 minutes. She said she knew. The front door opened, and Raffaele Belandi stepped outside. He didn't run. He walked very slowly down the 3 steps, and both men at the gate moved back 1 pace without anyone telling them to. He looked his mother over from head to toe, looked at the paper bag in her hand, then told the 2 men to go inside and wait. They went at once. Antonia set the paper bag on the porch table and sat down. She told him to sit. Rafe didn't sit. He asked where she had been. She said she had gone to buy bananas. He asked how she had gotten there. She said she had taken the bus at the corner of Elmwood, the way she always did. He asked how often always meant. Antonia was quiet for a moment, then said once a month, and that she had been doing it for 4 years. Rafe stood there for a very long time. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice with anyone, and everyone who knew him understood that wasn't a good thing. He said that for the last 40 minutes, she had been outside every layer of protection, inside a store with 30 people and 14 cameras, in a city where half the people knew her face. He said he had spent 10 years building a system with only one purpose, and that morning she had walked out of it on a bus. Antonia said she knew. He asked why. She said because she was 76 years old, and she had spent 22 years living in a house with men guarding the doors. And once a month she needed one morning when no one was guarding her. She said she had taken the housekeeper's coat by mistake that morning, so there was no wallet in the pocket, and she hadn't realized it until she was already standing at the register. Rafe asked why she hadn't told them who she was. She looked at her son and asked what he thought would have happened if she had. He said they would have given her the groceries and apologized. She said exactly, and that was precisely why she hadn't said anything. She said she wanted to know how people treated an old woman with no name, no one behind her, and nothing in her pocket. Rafe said, "And now you know." Antonia said, "Now I know." Then she added that she knew something else too. She told him what had happened. She told him a manager had ordered her to leave the groceries behind and step aside, loud enough for everyone in line to hear. She told him someone had made a remark about her shoes. She told him she had asked for 1 more minute, and no one had given her one. She told him someone had lifted a phone and started recording, and she had seen the phone, but she hadn't turned her face away because turning away would only make her look more guilty. She told him the manager had called security. Then she told him about the cashier. She said the girl had been standing right there at Register 3, and she had heard everything just like everyone else. But unlike everyone else, she had stopped what she was doing. She said the girl hadn't asked who Antonia was. She hadn't asked where she lived, hadn't asked whether anyone was coming to pick her up. She had simply reached into the pocket of her apron, taken out every bit of money she had, placed it on the counter, and scanned the 3 bananas. Rafe asked how much she had put down. Antonia said she hadn't looked closely, but she remembered it was more than $4.20, And she remembered that after the girl put the money on the counter, there was nothing left in her apron pocket. She said the manager had told her to get back to work, and the girl had kept scanning. She said the people behind them had laughed, and someone had said she was sticking her nose where it didn't belong, and the girl had kept scanning. Rafe asked her name. Antonia said she had asked, and the girl had said her name was Addie. She had asked Addie what, and the girl had said just Addie. Rafe asked if she remembered anything else. She said no. That was all she remembered, except that when she walked away carrying the paper bag, the girl hadn't watched her leave. She had already turned to the next customer. Rafe stood still for a moment, then went inside. He pulled out his phone and called Teddy Brandt. He said there was a cashier at the Harvest Lane store named Addie. Tuesday morning shift, register 3. He told him to find her. Then he added one more sentence, and that was the one that mattered. He said, find out what happened after my mother left. That evening was supposed to be the night they finalized the guest list. Priscilla Hargrove had been sitting at the dining table since 7 o'clock, with 3 folders and 2 seating charts, and when Rafe came into the house, she only looked at the clock and said nothing. He had been sitting there for about 10 minutes when his phone vibrated. He stood up and went out to the porch. By the time he came back inside, Priscilla had already closed the folders. She said she only wanted to understand one thing. She said they hadn't managed to arrange a single evening together all week, and now tonight they were abandoning this one because of 3 bananas. Rafe said it wasn't because of the bananas. Priscilla asked what it was because of then, because his mother had been spoken to harshly by a supermarket manager that happened to people every day, and if she had simply said who she was, none of it would have happened. Rafe said exactly, and that was the point. Priscilla said she didn't understand, then said there was something else she did understand. She said the cashier had obviously recognized his mother. Rafe asked why she was so sure. Priscilla said because no one gave every dollar in their pocket to a stranger unless they knew who that stranger was. She said she didn't blame the girl. It was smart. The girl was probably just waiting a few days until someone came to the store asking about her, and that would be that. Rafe said his mother told him the girl had looked at her the way she would look at any ordinary old woman. Priscilla said then she must have been hoping for something. Everyone hoped for something. That was how the world worked. Rafe said that statement said more about her than it did about the girl. Priscilla put down her pen. She said she hadn't meant anything by it. Rafe said he knew. Then he said he would be home late, and he left. Teddy Brandt arrived just before 11 o'clock that night, carrying a thin file and something else inside a cloth bag that he didn't take out right away. He gave his report first. Her full name was Adeline Marsh, 27 years old, employed as a cashier at Harvest Lane Market for 2 years and 3 months. She had been fired within 40 minutes of the incident. No prior warnings, no disciplinary reports anywhere in her file before that day. The only report had been written that afternoon, and the reason listed wasn't insubordination toward a manager, but a cash register discrepancy of $5.05. Rafe looked up. He asked what the $5.05 were. Teddy said it was her own change, and she hadn't been able to retrieve it because the coin drawer had locked when the manager ordered the transaction stopped. Rafe said nothing. Teddy continued reading. Her mother had died 14 months earlier after a long hospitalization, leaving more than $41,000 in medical debt in Adeline's name. Her father had died many years before that. She was supporting a younger sister named Junie, 19 years old, a first-year student at a community college, and that afternoon her sister had missed the 5 o'clock deadline to pay an exam fee. The 2 sisters rented an apartment above a laundromat on Cranston Street. Adeline had studied nursing for 3.5 years before dropping out when her mother's condition worsened, and she was still 96 credits short. Rafe asked what she had done after she was fired. Teddy said she had walked home. Rafe stopped. He asked if she had walked home. Teddy said, yes, sir, 4 miles. Rafe didn't ask anything else about that. Then Teddy took the other item from the cloth bag and placed it on the table. It was a thick, worn, hardcover notebook, its spine repaired twice with tape. He said he had found it in her employee locker. She had been dismissed so suddenly that she hadn't had time to take it with her. Rafe opened it. The first page held a hand-drawn table, week by week, item by item, spoilage rates calculated in percentages, written in blue ink, with a column beside them listing the reasons in small handwriting. Late delivery, truck not refrigerated, stacked more than 3 layers high. Shipment arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, no one there to receive it. Left outside the storage area until 7. Rafe turned the page. There were pages where she had redrawn the delivery schedules of all 4 suppliers, pages comparing unit prices month by month, and one page where she had calculated that if the delivery time for leafy greens were moved from 6 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the spoilage rate would fall by roughly 1/4. Beneath it, she had written one short line: proposed, not approved. Near the end were 2 consecutive pages, showing the same item from the same supplier, at 2 different unit prices, both clearly dated, and she had circled both figures in red, without writing anything more. Rafe turned the pages for a long time. He went all the way to the end, then started again from the beginning. Teddy waited. At last, Rafe closed the notebook, rested one hand on its cover, and said that the record-keeping in this notebook was the store manager's job. Teddy said yes. Rafe asked the manager's name. Teddy said Desmond Pike. 3 days later, at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 black cars turned onto Cranston Street and stopped in front of the laundromat. They didn't pull into the open spaces along the curb. They stopped in the middle of the street, one behind another, and none of them shut off their engines right away. The laundromat owner, who had been standing outside the door, stepped back inside. 2 men smoking on the stoop across the street stood up and went into the house without saying a word to each other. The entire block went silent in less than 10 seconds. Junie was studying at the table beside the window. She looked down, then stood up, then called her sister in a voice that sounded nothing like it usually did. Addie was washing dishes. She dried her hands, came out, looked over Junie's shoulder, and Junie whispered the name people in this state didn't say out loud on the street. Addie asked if she was sure. Junie said everyone at her school knew those cars, and she stepped away from the window. Footsteps sounded on the wooden stairs. Addie told her to go into the back room. Junie didn't go. Addie opened the door before anyone had the chance to knock. The first person out of the middle car and up the stairs was an old woman. She moved slowly, one hand on the railing, and when she looked up, Addie recognized her at once. Addie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She said, "Ma'am." Antonia said, "Hello, Miss Addie." Then a man came up behind her. He wasn't unusually tall, and he wasn't wearing anything remarkable, only a thin gray sweater. But when he stepped into the doorway, the room seemed to shrink around him. Junie took one step back. He looked at Junie first and gave her a slight nod of greeting, then turned his eyes to Addie. He said he was Antonia's son. Behind him came a younger woman, and farther back, Teddy Brandt stopped at the foot of the stairs and didn't come up. Addie invited them inside. The room had a dining table with 2 chairs, an old sofa, and not enough space for 4 people to sit. Antonia sat down on the sofa at once, as naturally as if she were sitting in her own home. Addie pulled out the 2 dining chairs. She said she was sorry the place was so small. Rafe said it was fine. Priscilla remained standing. Addie went to get water. She poured 3 glasses. She handed the first one to Antonia. Antonia took it, said thank you, and drank. Addie offered the second glass to Priscilla. Priscilla said no, thank you, and didn't take it. There was a brief silence. Antonia set down her glass and said the water here was clean. Priscilla said she hadn't said it wasn't. Antonia said she offered you a glass of water, saying no was enough. Priscilla fell silent. Addie set the second glass on the table and said nothing. Rafe took the third glass and drank a sip. Then he said he needed to tell her something, and he asked permission to be direct, because he wasn't good at talking around things. He said his name was Raffaele Belandi. He said he knew she had heard that last name, and he knew what she was thinking. Addie said nothing. Rafe said his family had many things, and most of those things he had no intention of bringing into this room. He said he had come to talk about a company called Belandi Foods. It was a produce distribution and retail network, with 19 transfer warehouses across 4 states, more than 400 employees, and within 5 years it would be everything that carried the Belandi name. He said he was separating it from the old part of the family, separating it completely, on paper, step by step, and that was the work he had been doing every day for the past 3 years. Addie asked why he was telling her any of this. Rafe said because the company had a management trainee program that accepted 11 people each year, and he wanted her to apply. Junie stood in the corner of the room and seemed to stop breathing. Antonia looked down at her glass of water. Priscilla looked out the window. Addie sat very straight in the dining chair, both hands resting in her lap, and she looked at the man who had just said those words, then at the old woman sitting on the sofa in her home, then down at the floor. Rafe didn't rush her. He simply set his glass of water on the table and waited. Addie said no before he had even finished speaking. She thanked him, but said no. Rafe asked, why? She said because she had bought bananas for his mother. She said she knew where this was going, and she didn't want to go there. She said $4.20 couldn't buy a place inside anyone's company, and if she accepted, then for the rest of her life, she would be the girl who traded 3 bananas for a job. Rafe listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt her. Then he said that was the reason he knew who she was, not the reason he was offering her anything. He reached behind him, took a worn hardcover notebook from the cloth bag, its spine repaired twice with tape, and placed it on the dining table. Addie looked at the notebook, and her face changed completely. She said that was hers, that it had been in her employee locker. Rafe said yes, and now it was here. He said he had read the whole thing twice. He said that on page 41, she had calculated that moving the delivery time for leafy greens from 6 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon would reduce spoilage by roughly 1/4, and underneath she had written that it had been proposed and not approved. He said he had 19 transfer warehouses, and paid people with degrees to do exactly what she had spent 2 years doing with a blue ballpoint pen, without anyone paying her a single cent for it. He said he wasn't inviting her because she was kind. He said there were plenty of kind people. He said he was inviting her because she had counted. Addie sat in silence for a very long time. In the corner of the room, Junie still hardly dared to breathe. Then Addie said that if that was true, she had 3 conditions. And before he could answer, she said that if he refused even one of them, her answer would still be no. Rafe said he was listening. First, she said, she would submit an application and take the entrance exam like everyone else, the same test, before the same panel. And if she failed, she would go home. No one was allowed to call anyone, and no one was allowed to say a single word on her behalf. Rafe said agreed. Second, she said, no debt forgiveness, no gifts, no house, no car, no money beyond the salary for the position she actually worked. She said her mother's medical debt belonged to her, and she would repay it over however many years it took. Rafe said agreed. Then she paused longer before giving him the third condition. She said she knew what kind of family his family was. She said she had grown up in this city. She wasn't naive, and she wasn't going to sit there pretending she didn't know. She said that if there ever came a day when he, or anyone in his company, handed her a document to sign, an invoice to create, or a number to move from one place to another for the purpose of cleaning a single dirty dollar, then she would leave that same day, without notice and without negotiation. By the time she finished, her hands were clenched together in her lap. No one in the room said anything. Teddy Brandt stood at the bottom of the stairs below, looking up. Rafe remained silent so long that Junie thought everything had fallen apart. Then he said that was exactly why he needed her. Priscilla spoke immediately. She asked if he had heard what the girl had just said to him, that she had just told him to his face what she thought his company was, inside her own home, with her own glass of water. She said she didn't understand why someone who had just lost a cashier job was sitting there making demands. Antonia set her glass of water on the table and said only one sentence. She said the girl isn't setting conditions for you. She's setting them for herself. Priscilla fell silent. Rafe stood up. He said Teddy would send the examination notice to this address sometime that week, that the test would be the following Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that if Addie arrived late, the panel wouldn't wait for her. Addie said she wouldn't be late. Antonia stood, walked past Addie, and rested one hand on her shoulder for a moment without saying anything, then left. After the 3 cars were gone and voices began returning to the block, Junie sat down in the chair Rafe had just left. She asked her sister if she was scared. Addie looked at her notebook lying on the dining table. She said she wasn't afraid of him. Junie asked what she was afraid of then. Addie said she was afraid she would get used to having money. The following Monday, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Addie sat down at desk 14 in the examination room with 32 other people. The test had 3 sections and lasted 4 hours. The final section was based on a real situation, a chain of 7 stores with spoilage rates above the acceptable threshold, with data provided and questions asking for the cause and the solution. Addie read the table of numbers and her hand trembled slightly, because she had been looking at that exact shape for 2 years in blue ballpoint ink. She turned in her test 20 minutes early. The results came 9 days later. She ranked second among the 11 people accepted, and she read the sheet 3 times on the front steps before taking it upstairs to show Junie. On her first day at the Belandi Foods building, the person who met her was Camille Rourke. the director of operations. Camille shook her hand once, briskly and dryly, then led her through 3 floors, naming the departments in the even voice of someone who had done this many times before. Not one unnecessary sentence, not one missing sentence. As they passed the documentation department, Camille said that everyone here called one another by their first names, not by titles, and Addie said thank you. Camille said, "You don't need to thank me. It's the rule." By noon, it started. In the 4th floor dining room, a group of assistants sat at a corner table, and they weren't lowering their voices very much. Someone said they had heard she used to work at a supermarket. Someone else said not just worked there, she was a cashier. Someone laughed and said apparently scanning barcodes counted as supply chain experience now. Someone said more quietly that there was supposedly some story involving the Belandi family's old lady. And if it was true, then this was the cheapest admission ticket in company history, $4.20. The whole table laughed. Addie was standing at the water dispenser about 4 steps away with a tray in her hands. She didn't turn around. She filled her cup, put the lid on, and started toward an empty table at the far end of the room. She had taken 2 steps when the laughter stopped. Rafe Belandi was standing in the doorway. No one knew how long he had been there. The entire room stood up, some of them rising before they even understood why they were doing it. He walked in slowly, stopped at a measured distance from the corner table, and spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He said Miss Marsh came to our attention because she helped my mother. He said the reason she's still here is that she took the same test every one of you took, before the same panel, and she placed second. He said if anyone wanted to see the scores, Human Resources had them on file. Then he gave the last sentence in the same voice. He said if her presence makes anyone in this room feel threatened, work harder. He didn't look at anyone in particular. Then he turned and left. On his way out, he passed Addie without looking at her, without nodding, without doing anything at all, and Addie understood that he had done it deliberately. Priscilla Hargrove was standing in the hallway outside, close to the door, and she had been there from the beginning. She didn't argue. She didn't say a single word to Rafe as he passed. She only smiled and nodded, the exact nod of someone agreeing with something entirely reasonable. Then she stayed there a little longer. Camille Rourke came out of the dining room carrying a stack of files against her chest, and Priscilla called her name. Camille stopped. Priscilla said she hadn't had a chance to speak with her yet. Camille said yes. Priscilla asked how long she had been with the company. Camille said 12 years. Priscilla lifted one eyebrow. Not much. Only enough to be noticed. She said that's a long time. Then she said, "Have a good day," and walked away. Camille remained in the hallway. She watched the woman continue all the way down the corridor, turn at the elevators, and disappear. Camille stayed where she was, the stack of files held against her chest, and she didn't understand why those 3 words remained inside her for so long. There had been nothing insulting in the sentence. There had been nothing untrue in it. She really had been there for 12 years. In the 3rd week, Addie was given a task no one in the trainee group wanted, which was to review the spoilage data from the Pawtucket transfer warehouse for the previous 6 months. They handed her a thick stack of reports and told her to summarize them. She read everything in 2 days, then submitted a single sheet of paper, saying she hadn't been able to summarize it yet because the numbers in the reports didn't explain why the spoilage was concentrated on Tuesdays and Fridays. They told her to summarize it according to the template anyway. She said yes. Then that night, she took a bus down to the warehouse at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The guard at the gate asked who she was. She showed him her employee badge and said she had come to watch the incoming shipments. He looked at the badge, looked at her, then opened the gate. At 2 o'clock in the morning, there were 14 people inside the warehouse and 4 trucks waiting. No one paid any attention to her for the first half hour. She stood in a corner beside column 7 and counted. She counted how many minutes a truck had to wait before someone came out to receive it. She counted how many times a pallet was lowered and then lifted again, because there was nowhere to put it. At 3 o'clock, a loader named Rudy asked why she was standing there freezing, and she said she was trying to understand why leafy greens spoiled so much on Tuesdays. The man laughed and said she could ask anyone there, and they could all give her the answer, except no one had ever asked. He said the produce trucks arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, but the warehouse shift changed at 6, so from 4 until 6, the shipment sat outside the receiving area, with no refrigeration and no one to sign for it. And when the new shift came in, the first thing they did was sign off on the pile of goods that had already been sitting there for 2 hours. Addie asked why the trucks arrived at 4. He said because the planning office scheduled deliveries according to business hours, calculating the time from when the truck left the farm and adding the driving time, and no one up there knew what time the warehouse shift changed. The second night, she went back. On the third night, she rode with a driver named Ollie on the Cranston route, sitting in the passenger seat for the entire trip, and he showed her the stretch of road that was closed from 3:30 in the morning because of construction, forcing every run to detour for another 20 minutes. He said he had reported it twice verbally, but no one had told him to put it in writing, so he hadn't. Addie wrote it down. On Thursday morning, she submitted an 11-page report with a hand-drawn table in the middle. By that afternoon, Camille Rourke called her upstairs. The report was on Camille's desk, open to the page with Rudy's name and Ollie's name written on it. Camille asked what time she had gone down to the warehouse. Addie said 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 nights in a row. Camille asked who had authorized it. Addie said no one had forbidden it. Camille asked whether she knew there was a department here specifically responsible for this work, and that they had far more complete data tables than she did. Addie said she had read those tables. Camille asked why, then, she had gone to ask the loaders. Addie said because they saw things the tables didn't contain. Camille was silent. She turned 2 pages, then turned them back. She said the report wasn't wrong. Then she rested one hand on the stack of papers, looked directly at Addie, and asked a completely different question. She asked who Addie was trying to impress. Addie didn't answer right away. She said myself. Camille asked what she meant. Addie said she needed to know whether she was here because of 3 bananas, and there was no one she could ask except herself, so somehow she had to find the answer on her own. She said the last 3 nights had been her way of doing that. Camille didn't say anything else. She told Addie to leave the report and go home. After Addie had left the office, Camille sat there and read it again from the beginning, and she read all the way to the end. She had been with this company for 12 years, and she had never once gone down to a warehouse at 2 o'clock in the morning. That 11-page report sat on Camille Rourke's desk for exactly 4 days, before it was sent up to the board with one short nota from her, saying that she recommended giving it a trial. The board approved a pilot project involving 3 stores and 1 warehouse, with a budget of $2 million and a 10-month timeline. And they put Addie Marsh in charge of coordinating it. Someone in the meeting room asked how long she had been with the company. Camille said 4 months. The person didn't ask anything else. The first thing Addie did didn't cost a single cent of the $2 million. She moved the delivery time for all leafy greens and soft fruit to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right at the beginning of the warehouse evening shift, instead of 4 o'clock in the morning. The planning department objected because it meant rebuilding the entire truck schedule from the ground up. And 2 suppliers objected because they were accustomed to cutting produce at midnight. Addie went to see both suppliers in person. She didn't call. She brought her hand-drawn table with her. She sat at the second farm for nearly 4 hours. In the end, they agreed to begin cutting 3 hours earlier, so the produce could make the afternoon run. The second thing she did was eliminate batch receiving altogether and replace it with receiving by individual truck, so no truck would have to sit waiting for someone to sign for it. The third thing she did was report the road closure that began at 3:30 in the morning to the transportation department in writing, including the name of the driver who had already reported it verbally twice, and she put his name on the very first line. The first month showed nothing. In the second month, spoilage edged downward. By the 4th month, the line on the chart had begun to separate clearly from the 3 control stores. By the 10th month, when the final report was closed, the last number was a 31% reduction in spoiled goods compared with the same period the year before, and most of that improvement had come from 2 changes that hadn't cost any money at all. The board read the report in a single morning. One member asked who was behind her. Camille said no one was behind her. She did it herself, and I approved the initial step. The person asked how old she was. Camille said 27. A brief silence settled over the room, the kind everyone could hear. Camille Rourke returned to her office after that meeting and sat in front of her screen for a long time. She had been here for 12 years. She knew exactly what this feeling was, and she also knew that what bothered her wasn't the figure of 31%. It was the question of who was behind her, and the fact that she had been the one required to answer that there was no one. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't do anything. She simply opened a new file, named it after the project, and began saving every report and every memorandum inside it, one by one, in chronological order, complete, with nothing missing. On the night the results were announced, Addie came home late. Junie was sitting at the dining table with a sheet of paper face down in front of her. She turned it over. It was the registration notice for the next exam session, stamped and already paid. Addie picked it up and looked at the submission date. It was nearly 4 months earlier. She asked where Junie had gotten the money. Junie said she had taken an evening job at the sandwich shop at the end of Broad Street, from 6 o'clock to 11 o'clock, 4 nights a week. Addie asked why she hadn't said anything. Junie said because if she had, Addie would have told her to quit, then gone out and borrowed money from someone, and Junie didn't want her borrowing from anyone. Addie opened her mouth, but no words came out. She sat down. Junie told her not to cry, that it wasn't a big deal. Then she added, in the ordinary voice of someone calculating grocery money, that Addie had paid $4 for an old woman, and Junie had paid $48 for herself, so now they were even. Addie laughed, and while she was laughing, tears ran down her face. The two sisters sat at that dining table until nearly midnight. The next morning, Addie arrived at the company early. She was standing beside her desk and hadn't even put down her bag when a young employee from the communications department came running down the hallway, actually running, and stopped in her doorway. He didn't say anything. He only held out his phone with the screen facing her, and his face was white. On the screen was a video 1 minute and 10 seconds long, shot vertically, slightly shaky, and Addie recognized the frame immediately because she had been standing inside it. The title was written in yellow letters, mocking an old woman who had gone to buy 3 bananas without enough money. Whoever posted it had cut together exactly the moment Antonia searched her coat pocket for the 4th time, exactly the moment she asked for 1 more minute, and exactly the moment laughter could be heard behind her. At 42 seconds, Addie's face appeared clearly across the screen as she bent down to place the money on the counter. The view count in the lower corner was 2,040,000, and it was still climbing. The young man from the communications department said the video had been posted at 11 o'clock the night before. Addie looked at the clock. 7:15 in the morning. She asked whether the company had notified anyone yet. He said no. He had been the first to see it. Addie told him to go report it immediately, and she picked up her own phone. She didn't call Rafe. She called Junie. Junie answered after the first ring, her voice hoarse, and said she already knew, that she had known since midnight. Addie asked what she had been doing all night. Junie said she had called 14 people from her class. Then those 14 had called others, and all of them had been sitting there reporting the video from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning. She said they had reported it under harassment of an elderly person, that category only, and they hadn't filed random reports. At 6:10, the video disappeared, 7 hours from the moment it had been posted. No one inside the Belandi Foods building had made a single call to get it removed. Rafe learned about it at 6:30, after it was already gone, and Teddy Brandt was the one who told him. Teddy added one short sentence, that during those 7 hours at least 4 accounts had saved copies. Rafe asked whether his mother's face was clearly visible in the frame. Teddy said yes. Rafe asked whether anyone had recognized her yet. Teddy paused for a moment, then said that at 3 o'clock in the morning, one account had left a comment saying the old woman looked very familiar, and that comment had received 400 likes before the video was removed. Rafe said nothing else. For 30 years, in this city, there hadn't been a single photograph proving that his mother ever went out alone. Now there was, and it had been online for 7 hours, with a date, a time, a location, the store itself, and even Register 3. The next morning, when Addie opened the door to leave for work, she saw a car parked at an angle across the street, and 2 men standing beside it. They didn't come toward her. They only nodded in greeting. When she walked to the bus stop, one of them followed about 20 paces behind her. When she boarded the bus, he got on too and sat in the last row. At lunchtime, when she went out to eat, he stood outside. That afternoon, when she came home, the other car was still parked in the same place. Junie asked who those men were. Addie said she didn't know yet. The following morning, she went straight up to the 8th floor of the Belandi Foods building, without an appointment. The assistant said he was in a meeting. Addie said she would wait. She waited 40 minutes. When the door opened, she went in and started speaking before it had even closed behind her. She said there had been 2 men outside her building since yesterday. One of them had ridden the same bus with her, and she wanted to know whose order it was. Rafe said mine. Addie said she hadn't signed up for this. She said she had given him 3 conditions in her apartment. He had agreed to all 3. and none of them had said that her sister would have to go to school under someone else's watch. She said Junie was 19 years old, that the girl was working evening shifts at the sandwich shop at the end of Broad Street, and she didn't want her getting used to having someone waiting by the curb. Rafe let her finish. Then he asked whether she had seen the video. She said yes. He asked whether she had seen her own face at 42 seconds. She said yes. He said 2 million people had seen it too, and among those 2 million were people who spent their entire lives looking for exactly one frame like that. He said he hadn't put a fence around her because he wanted to control her. He had put it there because she had appeared in the same frame as his mother, and he couldn't undo that. Addie said she hadn't signed up for this. Rafe said she hadn't signed up to step forward at that register that day either. Then he added 3 more words, more slowly, but you did. In the 12th month, the city opened bidding on a project that no one in the industry expected to attract much competition. 4 low-income neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Providence didn't have a single fresh produce store within a 2-mile radius, and the city council wanted to build an affordable distribution network serving all 4 areas, with 7 retail locations, 2 satellite cold storage facilities, and the entire transportation system to support them. The total value was $60 million. The contract would run for 3 years, and prices would be capped for the entire term. 2 companies submitted bids. One was Belandi Foods. The other was Corn and Vale, a larger and older distribution corporation that hadn't lost a single contract in the state in 6 years. The Belandi Foods board met on a Thursday morning to decide who would lead the project. 3 names were put forward. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to appoint 2 co-directors, and the first name read aloud was Adeline Marsh, based on the 31% result from the pilot project and the fact that she was the only person in the company who had personally gone out and measured every truck route on foot. The second name was Camille Rourke, who would oversee all financial records and documentation for the project and report through Addie as the primary lead. Camille put down her pen. She said she wanted permission to say something in front of the whole room, not privately. She said she had no objection to Miss Marsh's ability, that the pilot results were real, and that she herself had been the person who approved the first stage. Then she said the rest. She said she had joined this company at 24, had served under 3 chief executives, had rebuilt the entire documentation system after the audit in her 4th year, and had carried her department through 2 rounds of layoffs without losing a single employee. She said that 11 months earlier, the person she would now be reporting to had been standing behind a cash register at a store 4 miles away. She said she wasn't saying that to diminish anyone. She said she was saying it because if the board believed her 12 years and Miss Marsh's 11 months were worth the same thing, then she needed to know that today, not 3 years from now. No one in the room said anything. Addie sat at the far end of the table, and she didn't lower her eyes. Rafe Belandi sat in the second chair on the left, and he waited until the silence had run its course before speaking. He said her 12 years were real, and no one in that room denied them. He said he also hadn't chosen Miss Marsh because she was better than Camille, because she wasn't better than Camille, at least not yet. Then he said what he had wanted to say. He said Camille looked at the project and saw 7 distribution points, 2 cold storage facilities, and a price cap schedule. And she was right, because those were exactly the things written in the proposal. He said Addie looked at the project and saw the families living in those 4 neighborhoods. He said the project carried a 3-year price cap, which meant that whoever ran it would face at least one moment when they had to choose between protecting the price and protecting the profit, and he wanted the person making that choice to be someone who knew exactly what happened when a family had to walk 2 miles to buy vegetables. Camille didn't argue again. She said she understood. She said she would do her part fully. She said exactly that, fully, and nothing more. That afternoon, Addie went up to the 8th floor. She closed the door and said she needed to say something. She said she had been thinking all through lunch, and she didn't feel right about it. She said she didn't want this project to become the way she repaid him. She said if he had given it to her because of his mother, then those $60 million would become a debt instead of a job, and she would never again dare to tell him no for the rest of her life. Rafe listened to everything. Then he said he wasn't giving her a gift. He was giving her a burden. He said Corn and Vale were on the other side of this bid. They hadn't lost in the state in 6 years. They had a 20-person proposal team, and if Belandi Foods lost, people wouldn't say the company had lost. They would say she had lost. He said he knew that when he cast his vote. He said he voted for her anyway. Addie stood there for a moment, then said thank you. Rafe said don't thank me yet. Then he added that the proposal was due in 8 months. The first thing Addie did with the $60 million bid was go down to Olneyville, and she went alone, by bus. The residents' meeting was held at the neighborhood community center at 7 o'clock in the evening, with only adults seated in the hall, around 40 people altogether. She spoke briefly about the project, then sat down and said she had come to listen. There was a long silence before a woman in the third row stood up. She said that in the last 15 years, 4 different groups had come there. She said it was always the same. They came, they took photographs, they called the neighborhood by whatever names appeared in their reports. Then they built what they wanted to build, and expected everyone to be grateful. She said the market that opened the year before last had closed after 11 months, because they had put it at the far end of the avenue, in a place no one could reach on foot, and no one had asked a single question before deciding where to put it. Murmurs of agreement moved through the room. Addie asked what it would take for this time to be different. The woman said, "Ask before you decide." She said that was all, nothing more. Addie wrote those exact words in her notebook. She stayed for another 2 hours and wrote down everything. Near 9 o'clock, the meeting ended, and outside in the yard, the project's small test truck had been parked there since the afternoon. It had just been painted blue, and the children playing outside abandoned their game and ran over to look at it, every one of them wanting to touch the rear rolling door. The driver opened the truck so they could see inside. There were several sample crates of apples that needed to be rearranged, and Addie took off her coat and started helping. The children crowded around immediately, one passing apples, another stacking them, another counting each apple out loud and getting the number wrong, making all of them burst into laughter. Halfway through one crate, a little girl held back one apple and didn't put it into the box. She lifted it up for Addie to see. The apple was misshapen on one side, its stem slightly crooked, not round like the others. The girl said, "This one looks the saddest." Addie took it, examined it very seriously, then picked the roundest apple in the crate, handed it to the girl, and said, "Then I'll trade you." The girl laughed loudly and ran off to show everyone. Addie slipped the crooked apple into the pocket of her coat. The next day, she placed it on her desk, and it stayed there through all the months that followed. That night, she didn't take the bus home right away. She walked the entire route the project plan had laid out for the delivery truck, from the community center to the avenue, through the intersection with the traffic light, around the stretch of one-way road that the map in the proposal still showed as two-way. She timed it. Then she walked it again the next morning at 7 o'clock, during rush hour, and timed it again. The number she recorded was 26 minutes each way. The number in the financial plan was 18 minutes. That afternoon, she took her notebook up to Camille Rourke's office. Camille said the 18-minute figure came from routing software, and that software was the industry standard, used by everyone in the state. Addie said the software didn't know that the stretch of Manton had been one way since the year before. Camille said that if they changed the number from 18 to 26, operating costs over the full 3 years would rise by more than $2 million, and their bid would come in higher than Corin and Vale's. Addie said, "Then let it be higher." Camille asked if she understood that they would lose. Addie said she understood, but she also understood what would happen in the second year when the trucks couldn't make their schedules and the price cap couldn't be raised. The two of them argued for the rest of that afternoon. Neither raised her voice, and neither gave in. In the end, Camille said she would leave the old number in the main presentation and put Addie's figure in the appendix. Addie said she wanted it in the main document. Camille said she had already given her answer. At 10:30 that night, only 2 people were left on the 8th floor. Addie was still sitting with the route spreadsheet in front of her, and when Rafe passed by and saw the light still on in her office, he stopped in the doorway. He asked which number she was still arguing with. She said 18 minutes. He asked who was winning. She said no one yet. He stood there for a moment, then came in, pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and said there was something he had owed her for a long time. He asked whether she had ever wondered why it had been 3 bananas. Addie said she had thought about it, and she had assumed the old woman simply liked bananas. Rafe said no. He said his father's name was Salvatore, and he had died in prison 22 years earlier, when he was 61. He said that during the last 3 months of his father's life, he had been sick and couldn't keep much of anything down, and the only thing he could still swallow was bananas. Every time his mother went to visit him, she brought 3, because 3 was the maximum the rules allowed her to carry in at one time. He said that 22 years ago, on a Tuesday, his mother left the house at 7 o'clock in the morning to catch the first bus and arrived there just before 10. She stood in the waiting room with a paper bag in her hand. They told her to wait. She waited until 11, Then someone came out and told her there would be no visitation that morning. She asked why, and no one answered her, and she stood there until nearly noon, before they finally told her. His father had died the night before. Rafe said his mother carried that paper bag all the way back to the bus stop and didn't throw it away. He said that beginning the following week, once every week, she went out and bought 3 bananas. She brought them home, placed them on the dining table, and didn't eat them. At the end of the week, she threw them away, and the next week she bought 3 more. He said he had watched her do that for 22 years. At first he hadn't understood, later he did, and he had never once asked her a single question about it. Addie sat very still. She remembered Register 3. She remembered the manager telling Antonia to leave the groceries behind and step aside. She remembered the old woman quietly, saying that she had brought her wallet, asking for 1 more minute. She remembered thinking they were only 3 bananas. Rafe said he knew what she was thinking. He said she hadn't saved his mother from going hungry for 1 meal. He said she had saved her from having to leave her husband behind on that counter, in front of 30 people who were laughing. Addie couldn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked whether Antonia knew he had told her this. Rafe said no. He said he wouldn't tell anyone else again. He stood up, told her to go home early, then walked out and turned off the hallway light outside. That same evening, at a cafe on Thayer Street less than 2 miles from the building, Camille Rourke sat across from Priscilla Hargrove. Priscilla had invited her, and the invitation had sounded perfectly ordinary, just a cup of coffee, because they hadn't talked in a while. They spoke about the weather, about a new restaurant, about the wedding that would be held in the spring. Then Priscilla set down her cup and said she was only curious about one thing, and Camille shouldn't give it too much thought. She asked whether Camille had ever sat down and counted those 12 years again. Camille asked what she meant by counted them again. Priscilla said she meant sitting down and calculating what Camille had built during those 12 years, and who was now standing on top of the things she had built. She said she wasn't saying anyone was wrong. Everyone moved forward using what was already there. That was normal. She said she only thought it was a shame, because 12 years was a long time, and there were things that, when people took them away from you, they didn't take them loudly. They took them very politely, and you only realized what had happened after everything was already done. Camille didn't answer. Priscilla stood up and paid for both cups. Before leaving, she placed a business card face down on the table. She said it belonged to an acquaintance of her family, an operations consultant who was very good at reading numbers, and if Camille ever wanted an outside person to take a look, she should call. Then Priscilla smiled, said goodbye, and left. Camille remained there alone. She stared at the business card lying face down on the table for quite a while. Then she turned it over. The bid presentation took place on a Wednesday morning in the second-floor hearing room at City Hall, with 7 city council members, 3 co-investors, and 2 representatives from the audit office seated at the back of the room. Corin and Vale presented first. They had a 12-person team, a professionally produced slide deck, and the speaker was their vice president of development. He spoke for 40 minutes. He offered a price nearly 4% below the city's estimate, promised to have the operation running within 22 months instead of 36, and ended with a statement that his company had never missed a deadline on a public project anywhere in the state. There was polite applause. One council member nodded throughout the presentation. During the 15-minute break, Camille Rourke handed Addie a printed copy of the Belandi Foods presentation, the final version, printed that morning. Addie took it, but didn't have time to read it before they were called back in. She stepped up to the podium at 10:40. The first 15 minutes went normally. She spoke about the 4 neighborhoods, about the 2-mile distance, about the market that had closed after 11 months because it had been built in the wrong place, and she repeated the Olneyville woman's words exactly. Ask before you decide. Someone in the room looked up. Then she moved into the operating routes. She advanced to page 9. A 3-year transportation cost table appeared on the screen. Addie looked at the total line and stopped speaking. The number was about 22% lower than the number she had personally measured the week before. She looked down at the printed copy on the podium, and the printed copy showed the same number as the screen. She turned back to page 8, then page 7. The one-way travel time was listed as 18 minutes. She stood there for about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, several things became perfectly clear to her. She understood that if she simply kept speaking, no one in that room would discover the problem, because no one there had ever walked the Manton stretch at 7 o'clock in the morning. She understood that it would probably take until around the 6th month, when the trucks began missing their schedules, before anyone traced the problem back. And by then, the contract would already be signed, the price cap would already be locked, and the people who would have to live with the explanation would be the 4 neighborhoods, not her. She understood that if she stopped now, she might lose the bid that very morning. She set the printed copy down. She apologized to the council and said she needed to stop there. The room went silent. The chair asked whether there was a problem. Addie said the numbers on the screen weren't her numbers. She said the route time was listed as 18 minutes, but she had personally walked and timed that route twice the week before, once in the evening and once at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the result was 26 minutes because the Manton stretch had been one way since the year before, and the routing software hadn't been updated. She said the entire 3-year cost table had been calculated using the 18-minute figure, which meant the table understated the actual cost. A murmur moved through the room. The chair asked whether she was saying her own company's presentation was wrong. Addie said yes. He asked what she wanted the council to do. She asked for 48 hours to submit a corrected cost proposal, and she said she would understand if the council refused. Then she said one last thing. She said she was the head of the project. The presentation carried her name, and she wasn't blaming anyone else. She said she accepted full responsibility. One of the 3 investors closed his folder immediately. He said he didn't need 48 hours. He said his fund had a policy regarding inaccurate submissions, that the policy allowed no exceptions, and that he was withdrawing. He stood, thanked the council, and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him, and the sound of it was very clear. Addie remained at the podium. The second of the 3 investors was a silver-haired man seated in the front row. He didn't stand. He asked her one question. If she had kept talking, how long would it have taken before anyone knew? Addie said about 6 months, maybe longer. He asked why she had stopped. Then, she said because by then, I wouldn't be the one paying the price. He nodded slowly. Then he said he had been in this business for 23 years. He said he had sat through a great many presentations where companies hid a mistake and prayed he wouldn't notice it. And most of the time, he truly didn't. He said she was the first person he had ever seen stop her own presentation herself. He said his fund could wait 48 hours. The 3rd investor said his could wait too. The city council chair asked the room for its position, then approved the extension, and entered into the record that the deadline had been extended at the request of the bidder itself. From the beginning of the session to the end, Rafe Belandi sat in the 4th row against the wall and didn't say a single word. He didn't stand when the investor withdrew. He didn't look at Camille Rourke. He didn't look at the council. He only looked at the podium, at the woman standing there alone, and he kept looking the entire time. It took the information technology department less than 6 hours to find out who had made the change. The cost spreadsheet had 37 saved versions, and version 36 was the one Addie had approved at 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. With the 26-minute route time in the appendix, and 18 minutes in the main document, exactly as Camille had said she would leave it. Version 37 had been created at 11:04 Tuesday night. And in that version, the entire 3-year total had been recalculated using 18 minutes, including lines that had previously remained unchanged. The system log showed that the account used belonged to Camille Rourke. The workstation was the computer in her office, and the connection came through the 6th floor internal network. They called her upstairs at 10 o'clock the next morning. She said she had been home that night. They asked whether anyone could confirm it. She said she lived alone. They asked whether she had logged out before leaving. She was quiet for a moment, then said she didn't remember. They asked whether she had ever given anyone her password. She said no. They asked how she explained it then. She said she couldn't. By noon, the entire building knew. By afternoon, no one passed her office without glancing inside. People brought up the meeting when the project leaders had been chosen, brought up what she had said about her 12 years, and someone finally said out loud that now it made sense. Camille didn't argue with anyone. She sat in her office with the door open and worked as she did every other day, except no one came into her office anymore. That same afternoon, in another room 11 miles from the building, Gus Fiorentino sat across from Rafe Belandi with 4 other men who had been with the family since his father's time. Gus said he hadn't come to talk about the old days. He said he had come to talk about the last 3 years. He said for 3 years Rafe had been separating the company, putting everything on paper, opening doors, hiring outsiders, even bringing in a cashier, and he hadn't said anything. He said now there was a $60 million bid sitting in front of the entire city council. One investor had walked out in the middle of the presentation, and the company's own financial lead was under investigation. He said this wasn't bad luck. He said this was the price of opening the doors. He said in the old days, things like this never left four walls, and now it was sitting in the minutes at City Hall, with signatures and dates attached to it. Another man added that people outside had already started asking questions, and the Belandi name was being spoken in places where it hadn't been spoken for 10 years. Gus said he was proposing that they stop. Stop the bid, stop the 5-year plan too, go back to the old way, and everything would be quiet again within a month. Rafe listened to all of it. He didn't answer right away. He asked Gus one question, where the old way had taken his father. Gus said he wasn't going to talk about that with the man's son. Rafe said, then don't talk to me about this anymore. The meeting ended without anyone winning, and all 5 men left without shaking hands. That evening on the 8th floor, Rafe called Addie and Camille up at the same time. He said there were 20 hours left in the 48-hour extension. He said the corrected cost proposal had to be submitted before 10 o'clock the next morning. Then he moved to the second matter. And he said he was terminating Camille Rourke's employment that night. Camille stood up. She said she understood and asked permission to go clear out her office. Addie said wait. Rafe looked at her. Addie said she was asking him not to fire Camille yet. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Camille turned to look at her, and there was nothing on her face. Rafe asked why. Addie said it wasn't because she felt sorry for anyone. She said she had a technical reason and wanted to explain it. She said a person who had been with the company for 12 years, who had rebuilt the entire documentation system after the audit, understood the system logs better than anyone else in the building, including the information technology department. She said if that person wanted to alter a number, she wouldn't do it using her own account, on her own computer, at 11 o'clock at night, leaving a trail so obvious it could be found in 6 hours. She said she wasn't saying Miss Rourke was innocent. She was saying this didn't look like the work of someone with 12 years of experience. It looked like the work of someone who wanted people to find it within 6 hours. Rafe asked if she understood who she was asking him to give more time to. He said the woman standing beside her had stood up in the middle of a board meeting and objected to Addie being given the project, and had pushed Addie's number into the appendix after arguing with her for an entire afternoon. He said she was asking for more time for someone who wanted to bring her down. Addie said she wasn't asking for more time for anyone. She said she was asking for more time for the truth. Rafe was silent for a long time. Then he said he would give her 4 days, and if nothing new came out after 4 days, he would do what he had intended to do that night. Camille didn't say a single word from beginning to end. She left first, and in the hallway she stopped for a moment before continuing on. At midnight that night, Addie's phone vibrated. "Unknown number," she answered. On the other end was a woman's voice she hadn't heard in almost 2 years, and the woman apologized for calling so late, then said her name was Nadine Kowal. Nadine said she was sorry she had stayed silent that day, but she wasn't calling to talk about that. That could come later. She said she was calling because earlier that day someone had shown her a photograph taken during the bid presentation at City Hall, and in that photograph, sitting in the row behind the Corin and Vale team, was Desmond Pike. Addie asked what he was doing there. Nadine said he hadn't been at Harvest Lane for a long time. She said 4 months after Addie was fired, corporate came down for an inspection and discovered the issue with the scale codes and the 2 different unit prices for the same item from the same supplier, exactly what Addie had asked about before she was fired. They let Pike go quietly, without making a scene and without telling anyone. Then 3 months later, he appeared with the title of Operations Consultant for Corin and Vale. Nadine said she thought Addie should know. Addie sat on the kitchen floor until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, with her old notebook open across her lap. The next morning, she went to the Information Technology Department, and she didn't ask who had altered the file. She asked what someone would need to know in order to alter it. They said the person would need to know the project folder path, the version naming convention, and the fact that the 3-year summary table was linked by formula to the route time cell on page 7, because without knowing that, changing a single number would throw the entire table out of alignment, and anyone would notice immediately. Addie asked how many people inside the company knew all 3 things. They said not many, around 9. She asked what about outside the company. They said no one outside the company would know, unless someone had told them. That afternoon, she went up to Camille's office. She closed the door and asked only one question, whether during the last 6 months Camille had told anyone outside the company about the structure of the project files. Camille said no. Addie didn't ask again. She simply sat there. Camille stared out the window for a very long time. Then she said yes. She said that evening at the cafe on Thayer Street, she had sat with someone, and that person had asked whether she had ever sat down and counted her 12 years again. She said she had drunk 2 cups, and said more than she had intended to say. She said she hadn't given anyone her password. She swore she hadn't, but she remembered logging into the company's portal, using the cafe's open Wi-Fi that evening, while showing the project layout on her laptop. She had explained how the folders were arranged, how the versions were named, and how the entire table linked to a single cell. She had complained about work the way people often did, without realizing someone was capturing her login session right behind her. She said she had talked about it the way people complained about work. She said she hadn't been thinking. Addie asked the person's name. Camille said Priscilla Hargrove. Then she added that the woman had left behind a business card for an operations consultant, and Camille had turned it over and looked at it, and she remembered the name printed on it. She opened a drawer and took out the card. The name on it was Desmond Pike. That evening, a meeting was held on the 8th floor. Rafe was there. Teddy Brandt was there. The head of information technology was there. Addie was there, and Camille was there. They laid out the path. From a coffee meeting on Thayer Street to a business card. From the business card to a man working as a consultant for their direct competitor. And from that man to a login at 11:04 Tuesday night, using the account of someone who was at home. The information technology department confirmed one more detail that no one had noticed the day before. That login session had originated from a network address outside the building and had entered through a remote access portal Camille hadn't used once in 3 years. Rafe asked Camille whether she had anything she wanted to say. Camille stood up. She said she hadn't altered the file, and she had said that from the beginning. Then she said the rest, slowly and clearly, leaving out nothing. She said she had sat in that cafe because she was bitter. She said she had been bitter ever since the day she had been forced to answer before the board that no one was standing behind Addie. She said she had pushed the 26-minute figure into the appendix even though she knew Addie was right, and she had done it not because of the finances, but because she wanted that number not to belong to Addie. She said she was submitting her resignation effective that day and would accept every legal consequence for the part she had played. When she finished, she sat down. After the meeting, in the hallway, she called Addie back. She stood facing her and said, "You just saved me from a crime I didn't commit so that I would have to confess to one I did." She asked if Addie understood what she had just done to her. Addie said she did. She said, "I gave you back the right to choose for yourself." Camille looked at her for a long time, then gave one nod and walked away. Inside the room, Rafe was still sitting there. Teddy Brandt stood waiting beside the table. Rafe picked up the business card, turned it over twice in his hand, then set it down. He looked up at Teddy and said exactly 2 words. "Handle him." Addie was standing just outside the door to get her coat, and she heard both words. Addie stood outside the gate for 20 minutes before she finally pressed the bell. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night. The man who came to open the gate looked at her, then called inside, and a little while later she was led across the courtyard and into a room with nothing but a wooden table and 2 chairs. Rafe was sitting there with a glass of water. He asked if she wanted anything to drink. She said no. She remained standing. Her hands were shaking, and she knew he could see it, so she spoke at once because she was afraid that if she waited any longer, she wouldn't be able to say it. She said that afternoon she had been standing outside the door getting her coat and had heard the 2 words he said to Teddy. She said she didn't know what those 2 words meant inside this house. She said she hadn't come to ask. She had come to tell him one thing, that if he did what she thought he meant, then tomorrow morning she would submit her resignation, go to the police, and tell them everything she knew. When she finished, she stood still. Rafe didn't get up. He didn't say anything for long enough that Addie could hear the clock on the wall. Then he reached into a drawer, took out a blue folder, and slid it across the table toward her. He told her to open it. Addie did. The first page was a receipt confirming submission of documents to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Rhode Island. It had a case number, the name of the person who received it, a signature, and a timestamp. 6 o'clock that evening. Beneath it was an inventory of the submitted materials, including the remote access logs, screenshots of the login session at 11:04, the statement from the head of information technology, Camille Rourke's statement, and the business card bearing Desmond Pike's name, which had been assigned an evidence number. Addie turned through every page. Then she looked again at the timestamp. 6 o'clock in the evening, the 8th floor meeting had ended at 7:20. She had arrived here close to 11. She set the folder down on the table and couldn't say anything. Rafe said he had submitted everything first, then held the meeting. He said the meeting was so the people in that room could say what they had to say in front of one another, not so he could make a decision. He said the 2 words he had spoken to Teddy meant take the copies down to the attorney's office and submit the rest tomorrow morning. Then he said what he wanted her to understand. He said 10 years earlier, he had handled something exactly the way she was imagining in her head. He said he wouldn't tell her the details, and he never would. He said the result of that choice was that his father took all of it on himself and died in prison, while Rafe didn't. He said it had taken him 10 years to learn how to do everything through paperwork, through receipts, through timestamps, because paperwork was the one thing no one could take back. He said that was also why he had spent the last 3 years separating the company piece by piece. Then he looked at her and asked if she thought she was the only person in that room who had to choose. Addie sat down in the other chair. She remained there for a long time. Finally, she said she was sorry. Rafe said she didn't need to apologize. He said if she hadn't come there that night, then he would have been disappointed. 3 days later, Priscilla Hargrove came to the building. She went straight to the 8th floor. She said she wasn't denying the coffee meeting, that she had met Camille, and there was nothing unusual about that. She said she had given her the business card of an acquaintance who worked as a consultant, and there was nothing unusual about that either. She said she hadn't told anyone to alter anything. Rafe asked whether she had told him to do whatever was necessary. Priscilla went silent. Then she said she had done it for him. She said for the last 1.5 years. Everywhere he went, that girl's name was there. His mother talked about her every week. He had stood in the middle of the dining room and defended her in front of 40 people, and he had handed her $60 million after 11 months. Rafe said she could do the work. Priscilla said that girl was a cashier. She said he could buy her beautiful clothes, put her in an office, give her a title, but she would always be a cashier, and she would never belong in their world. Rafe repeated the 2 words back to her, our world. Priscilla said, you know what I mean. Rafe said he did, and that was the problem. He said he wasn't going to marry someone who believed a person's worth was measured by where they stood. Priscilla said, you're choosing her. Rafe said this wasn't about choosing anyone. He said even if Adeline Marsh had never existed, he would still be ending this today. Priscilla placed the ring on the table. She said he would regret it, because her family was the shortest and cleanest road he had. Rafe said he knew. She walked out, and the door closed behind her. 2 weeks later, Rafe Belandi filed to resign from the board of Belandi Foods, transferred all of his voting rights into an independent trust, and from that day forward, he no longer held a single vote in the company that carried his family's name. The corrected cost proposal was submitted before 10 o'clock the next morning, with the 26-minute route time in the main document, and Belandi Foods' bid came in nearly $2 million higher than Corrin and Vale's. The city council deliberated for another 3 weeks. In the end, they chose Belandi Foods, and in the official minutes they stated that the reason was the reliability of the cost estimate, specifically citing the bidder's own request for a delay in order to correct its submission. One afternoon after that, Antonia Belandi came to the building, took the elevator to the 6th floor, and stood in the doorway of Addie's office with a paper bag in her hand. She placed the bag on the desk beside the crooked apple and said, I owe you $4.20. Inside the bag were 3 bananas. Addie looked at it and couldn't speak right away. Antonia sat down. She said she had asked her son, and he had told her what he had told Addie that night in this office. She said she wasn't angry. She said she only wanted Addie to know one more thing he couldn't have told her because he hadn't been there that day. She said her own mother, an old woman who had been gone for a very long time, once told her that inside every person there was a decent person sleeping, and for most of life that person stayed asleep because everyone was busy, everyone was afraid, everyone had a reason. Antonia said there had been 30 people at that register that day, and all 30 of them carried someone like that inside. She said only yours was awake. Then she stood up and left without saying anything more. The paper bag remained on the desk. That evening, Rafe called Addie upstairs. He said he wanted to speak to her as an individual, not on behalf of the company. He said he had someone review the medical debt in her name and he wanted to erase it, and he wanted to buy her and Junie a small house on the east side of the city, close to Junie's school. Addie said no to both. Rafe asked why. She said because the 3 conditions she had stated in her apartment still stood, and the second one hadn't come with an expiration date. She said she had stood at the podium in City Hall and told everyone she accepted full responsibility, and they had believed her, and if tomorrow anyone discovered that she was living in a house he had bought, then everything she had said that morning would lose its meaning. Then she gave him the real reason, more quietly. She said she wanted the first roof that belonged to the two sisters to be one she had paid for herself. She said she could ask for a salary advance and repay it over 7 years, and she had already done the math. Rafe didn't push. He said he understood. Then he opened a drawer, took out a thin folder, and slid it toward her. He said this wasn't something he had bought with money. Inside was a letter from the nursing school, responding to a petition to reconsider expired credits, along with a decision allowing her to preserve all 96 of her old credits and enroll again for the spring semester as an evening student. He said it had taken 4 months, 3 petitions, and 2 afternoons sitting outside the registrar's office. He said Teddy had been the one who filed them. Addie held the paper, and her hands began to shake. That weekend, she went back to Harvest Lane. She took the bus, wore her old coat, carried a basket like any other customer, and bought vegetables and a carton of milk. Nadine Kowal was working at Register 1. The two women looked at each other. When it was Addie's turn to pay, Nadine scanned each item very slowly, then said she was sorry. She said that day she had been standing 4 steps away and hadn't said a single word. Addie said you were afraid. She said, I don't blame you. Nadine said he's gone now. I suppose you know. Addie said, I know. Nadine asked if she felt relieved. Addie stood still for a moment, then said no. She said him falling doesn't give me back the 4 miles I walked that day. She picked up her bag of groceries and left. 3 weeks later, on an evening when only 2 people remained on the 8th floor, just as on the night he had told her the story of the 3 bananas, Rafe said there was something he wanted to tell her, and it had nothing to do with work. He said he had waited until he no longer held a single vote in the company before saying it, so she wouldn't have to weigh anything against it. He said he cared for her. He said he had cared for her for longer than he wanted to admit. Addie sat in silence for a very long time. Then she asked him one question, and she asked it very softly. She asked, Are you sure you care for me, or do you care for the cleaner version of yourself you become when you stand beside me? Rafe didn't answer immediately. He sat there and let the question remain between them for a long while. Then he said he didn't dare lie to her about even one thing. But he said there was one thing he did know for certain, that he didn't want to go back to being the man he had been. Addie said, Then give me time. Rafe said, You have it. 4 years passed. By then, Belandi Foods had become a completely legitimate company, governed by an independent board, with not a single vote remaining under the Belandi name, and the network of 7 retail locations serving 4 neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Providence had entered its 3rd year without having to raise the price cap even once. Addie Marsh had completed all 96 credits through evening classes, and she kept her diploma in a drawer instead of hanging it on the wall. Junie had graduated and was working. The 2 sisters finished repaying the salary advance in the 4th year, and the small house on the east side of the city was in both their names. One October morning, the board secretary called Addie upstairs and handed her a document nominating her for the position of Chief Executive Officer. The first thing she did was call Rafe. She asked whether he had arranged it. He said he had left the board 3 years earlier, he didn't have a single vote, and he hadn't even been allowed to read the nomination file. She said she still didn't believe him. He told her to go look for herself. So she went down to the records room and asked to see the original minutes. They handed her an 11-page file. She turned to the final page to find the signature, and she froze. The nomination had been written by Camille Rourke, who was now serving on the investment committee of a fund in Boston. 11 pages of data analysis, citing every project, every number, every milestone, without a single sentimental sentence. Only the final line was different. It said that I once worked under her for 6 months, that I tried to bring her down, and she answered by proving that I was innocent. Then came the closing sentence, that I am not nominating her because she is kind. I am nominating her because she is right. Addie accepted the position, and she gave only one condition. She said she never wanted to become so important that she could no longer sit down and talk with the person standing in line at the warehouse. The board entered that condition into the official minutes. During her first week in the new role, she went down to the Pawtucket warehouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at the beginning of the shift. In row 7, a young man was packing apples into crates, working quickly and neatly. She asked his name. He said Milo Vance, 20 years old, and that he had been working there for 5 months. She asked if he was in school. He said he studied accounting at night, 3 evenings a week, and worked the afternoon shift so he could make it to class. She asked whether school was hard. He said it was, but he could handle it. Addie said that 4 years earlier, she had been standing behind a cash register exactly 4 miles from where they were. Milo looked at her and said she was joking. She said she wasn't. She took out a piece of paper, wrote down the phone number for the employee scholarship program the company had launched the year before, handed it to him, and told him to call that week, because the application deadline was at the end of the month. Milo held the paper and asked why she was helping him when she didn't even know who he was. Addie said because once, someone stood beside me when they had no reason at all to stand there. That evening, after dark, she drove home past Cranston Street and slowed down a little when she passed the old laundromat. She thought about that Tuesday morning, years ago. She had $9.25 in her apron pocket, and she had every right to keep that money. She didn't know who the old woman was. She wasn't hoping for a job, wasn't hoping for a different life, wasn't hoping that anyone would come knocking on her door. And the truth is, doing something good isn't always rewarded. There will be many times in life when you help someone and nothing comes back to you. Not a thank you, not an opportunity, nothing at all. But kindness is still worth choosing. Because if she had walked away that day, the person she would have had to live with for the rest of her life would have been herself. Don't wait until you're rich to be kind. Give your time. Give your respect. Take the time to sit and listen to someone who has no one else to talk to. 3 bananas were worth only $4.20. What changed her entire life wasn't the $4.20. It was the 4 seconds in which she decided to step forward. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you think needs to hear it today, so that every day we can continue discovering more stories worth hearing together. How did Addie's story make you feel? And if you had been standing at Register 3 that morning, what would you have done? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.